What's the one absolutely essential item you need to survive indefinitely in the wild? Well, that's easy, friends. It's my beard oil, Beard Blaze. Some of you might have heard this before, but I've got another channel called Business Blaze, and that actually led to the development of this very product. Long story short, I made a joke about YouTubers having beauty lines, and a fan of that channel wrote to me being like, Simon, don't start a beauty line, but I can help you develop a fantastic beard oil. We've made a whole lot of them, and I've tried them all out myself. They're the best of the best. Also, what we did, I've used beard oils before. If you've got a big beard, or just a regular sized beard, or just, a beard of any type, you can use some beard oil, and it just makes it smoother and better and more glorious. And as I said, I've used these before, beard oils. They always come in very tiny bottles and they're very expensive. This is a proper sized bottle. I don't have some sort of giant monster hands, just regular sized hands in a large bottle, and it's at a very affordable price. So just go to beardblaze.com, check it out. There's no special code or anything because it's mine. Please check it out, and there's a link below, and let's get into the video. For most of us, going on an afternoon hike or spending a lazy weekend at a developed campground is as close as we'll get to roughing it in the wild. Sadly, we'll never sleep in caves, suffer the rigors of hypothermia. Sadly, eat grubs or resort to drinking our own urine while nursing a festering compound fracture. Bear Grylls, what's up? On the other hand, some unfortunate folks, like the ones on this list, were thrust into truly epic survival situations due to planes crashing, boats capsizing, world wars, and of course, good old-fashioned car crashes. So, let's get into them. In late 1981, 28-year-old tinkerer, sailor, and adventurer Stephen Callahan climbed on board a sailboat that he'd personally designed and built and set out on what would become one of contemporary history's most enduring tales of ocean survival. At just 21 feet, the Napoleon Solo was tiny by any standards, but Callahan planned to pilot it to distant ports in England, Bermuda, Spain, and the Canary Islands. But after an uneventful transatlantic voyage with a friend, Callahan entered a solo sailing race from Penzance, England, to Antigua, but along with other boats, he dropped out off the coast of Spain due to damage resulting from harsh weather and heavy seas. Callahan made repairs and continued his journey down the coast of Portugal, Madeira, and the Canary Islands, eventually departing in late January of the following year for Antigua. But a week out, in a fierce gale, the Napoleon Solo's hull was punctured after contact with an unknown object, which Callahan later insisted was a whale. The boat became inundated with water, but it didn't sink thanks to the watertight compartments that Callahan had designed into the craft for just such occasion. However, conditions on board were unmanageable, and Callahan set out in an inflatable 6-person life raft that measured just 6 feet, that's 1.8 meters across. He tethered it to the Napoleon Solo and made several trips between the two to retrieve supplies like a sleeping bag, cushions, first aid kit, navigation charts, a spear gun, flares, an ocean survival manual, and a solar still. Shortly thereafter, a rogue wave tore the tether, and Callahan drifted away into the great expanse, moving westward with the prevailing winds and currents. After exhausting the meager food supplies had salvaged from the sinking ship, Callahan survived by spearing mahi-mari, scavenging barnacles from underneath his life raft, and collecting flying fish that landed inside at night. Ironically, an ecosystem had evolved around the castaway's lonely vessel, and it probably saved his life. He collected drinking water from 2 solar stills, which, with the rainwater he captured, usually produced about a pint of water or more per day. Callahan also had an EPIRB, Emergency Position Indicating Radio Beacon, but at the time they weren't monitored by satellites, and due to the area's vastness, he knew being spotted by aircraft, passing ships, or even dedicated rescuers was unlikely, if in fact anyone was looking for him at all. Though during the ordeal he spotted 9 ships and fired off numerous flares, none of them were seen. To pass the time, he forced himself to stay busy even when things seemed hopeless. He exercised, made water around the clock, fished, and rigged makeshift shelters to protect himself from wind, sea spray, and the blinding sun, while simultaneously dealing with marauding sharks, raft punctures, physical deterioration, and mental anguish. Then, in mid-April of 1982, he spotted twinkling lights on the island of Marie Galante, southeast of Guadeloupe. The following day, his 76th at sea, he was picked up by fishermen who'd spotted the bevy of birds flitting over his raft. During his 2+ months in the ocean raft, Callahan lost nearly a third of his body weight, and his skin was covered with welts, sunburn, and sores caused by constant contact with seawater. He was taken to a local hospital for an afternoon, but he left that evening and spent the following weeks recovering while hitching rides with local boats traveling to nearby islands. Callahan's remarkable story has been featured on a number of survival television programs, yet since the incident he's made dozens of similar passages and more than a few ocean crossings, on most of which he was accompanied by other crew. All told, he drifted nearly 2,000 nautical miles across the open ocean, what he refers to as the greatest wilderness in the world. Describing the sensation of laying in his raft at night, staring up at the stars, he said it was a view of heaven from a seat in hell. Born in Lima, Peru in 1954, Julian Koepke's German mother and father worked at the city's Natural History Museum as biologists, but when she was 14, the family moved to a remote research station in the Amazon rainforest. By all accounts, Koepke became the consummate jungle child, whiling away her days often unsupervised, learning survival techniques and studying local plants and animals, though she eventually returned to Lima to attend high school. In 1971, her mother made the journey back to Lima to collect her and planned on the two of them returning to the research station on December the 20th, but Koepke implored her to postpone departure until after December the 23rd so they could attend her graduation ceremony. In a fateful decision, her mother agreed and purchased 2 tickets for a flight on Christmas Eve with Líneas Aéreas Nacionales S.A. or LANSA, the national airline with a less than stellar safety reputation. In fact, Koepke's father had urged the pair to delay their return until a flight could be found on a different airline, though they ignored his warnings. After an uneventful takeoff, the 4-engine Lockheed L-188 Electra turboprop airliner was struck by lightning during a thunderstorm, after which, according to investigators, it broke into multiple pieces before falling to the ground 2 miles below. Out of 92 on board, including passengers and crew, Koepke, still strapped into her seat, was the sole survivor, but she suffered serious wounds, including deep lacerations, a broken collarbone, and a right eye that was swollen shut. Koepke's first priority was to find her mother, who had been seated next to her, but her search proved unsuccessful. She later learned that her mother had also survived the crash, but perished a few days later from her injuries. Surviving on candy she found strewn around the crash site, Koepke located a creek and began following its course as her father had taught her to do. If you head downstream on a river, you'll almost always get to civilization. After 10 days, she discovered a rickety boat moored near a small shelter and poured gasoline from its tank onto her wounds that had become infested with maggots. She spent the night in the shelter, but hesitated to take the boat because she didn't want to steal it. But the following morning, she was found by village fishermen, and shortly thereafter, a local bush pilot flew her to a regional hospital, where she was eventually reunited with her father. After recovering from her injuries, Koepke assisted search parties in locating the crash site and recovering the bodies of the victims. Koepke's unlikely survival has been studied carefully, and it's largely believed that the row of 3 seats, of which had been in the middle, had acted as parachute that had slowed her fall, and that the chairs beside her and the thick foliage on which it landed may have dampened the impact. Koepke eventually moved back to Germany to study biology and ultimately earned a doctorate before returning to Peru to study bats. For her autobiography, When I Fell from the Sky, which was released in March of 2011, she received the Korean Literature Prize. Koepke's story has been featured in a number of dramatic and documentary films, one by famed director Werner Herzog, who joined her on a trip to the crash site during production, which she described as a kind of therapy. Born on March 19, 1922, in a rural village in south-central Japan's Wakayama Prefecture, at 18, Hiro Onoda enlisted in the Imperial Japanese Army as the Second World War loomed. Onoda was trained as an intelligence officer, and in late December of 1944 he was sent to the Philippine island of Lubang, where he was ordered to do whatever he could to thwart an Allied invasion, including blowing up the small airstrip and scuttling the pier. Onoda's orders also forbade surrender and suicide, even if being overrun was imminent. Upon landing on the island, he joined forces with a group of soldiers already there, but despite their best efforts, Philippine and American forces retook Lubang in late February of 1945, and Onoda and his surviving compatriots fled to the hills. After just a few weeks, Onoda and 3 others were the only soldiers that hadn't surrendered or been killed or captured, and he was the senior officer. Though survival itself was a full-time job, the group carried out numerous guerrilla raids that included burning the village's rice, pilfering food, killing livestock, and attacking fishermen and farmers, and they had numerous shootouts with the local police. But by late 1945, the war was officially over, though Onoda and his comrades were unaware that Japan had surrendered. Meanwhile, American planes dropped leaflets informing them that the war had been over since October, but the wary survivors thought it was propaganda and feared they'd be killed in a trap if they surrendered. Later, more leaflets were dropped, this time with an actual surrender order printed and signed by Army General Tomoyuki Yamashita. To the men who had been in hiding for more than half a year, the leaflets were still suspect, and after close inspection, they determined that they weren't genuine, and again, they ignored pleas to surrender. However, there was dissension in the group, and one of the soldiers did leave and surrender, but not until 1949. Then again, in 1952, letters and family pictures were dropped from aircraft urging them to surrender, but the 3 soldiers concluded that this too was also a trick. Over the next few years, the group's situation became even more dire, and gunfights with indignant locals, fishermen, and police became more common, and another member of the group was killed in the early 1950s, and another in the early 1970s. Oh my god, these guys were in the jungle for a long time. Eventually, Onoda was the only one left, nearly 3 decades after the cessation of hostilities. Then in early 1974, Onoda was visited by an eccentric Japanese traveler who'd come to the Philippines specifically to find him, and after just 4 days on the island, he did just that. According to Onoda, the young man was a hippie who asked why he wouldn't come out, surrender, and return to Japan. The two became friends, but Onoda still refused to give himself up, claiming that he'd never been officially relieved of duty by a superior officer. The young man returned to Japan with photographs of himself and Onoda as proof of their encounter, and the Japanese government tracked down Onoda's commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, who had retired and become a book merchant. Taniguchi went to Labang Island in mid-March of 1974, finally met with Onoda, and fulfilled a promise he had made back in 1944. Whatever happens, will come back for you. Onoda was regarded as a hero, but he shunned the limelight and donated the large sum of money the government gave him for his efforts to a local shrine. Instead, Onoda set about writing an autobiography, which he titled No Surrender, My 30-Year War. Though the book was well received, a Philippine documentary crew who interviewed residents of Lubang discovered that it left out a few important details, like that he and his compatriots had killed nearly 36 innocent people after the war had ended. Nonetheless, he was officially pardoned by Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos in a televised ceremony, but the Japan he eventually went home to was much different than the one it was when he was growing up, and he lamented the shift away from traditional values. In early July of 2018, 23-year-old Angela Hernandez disappeared while driving a Jeep Patriot from Portland, Oregon to Lancaster, California to visit relatives. The 940-mile trip should have taken just a few days, but after swerving to avoid an animal in the road near Big Sur, she careened off a cliff and crashed into the boulder-strewn beach more than 200 feet, that's 60 meters below. Hernandez later recounted that she remembered little more than seeing the animal, but that when she woke up later, she was still strapped into the crumpled SUV, covered in blood and excruciating pain, and that the driver's window was still rolled up and water was lapping at her knees. Hernandez unfastened her seatbelt and was able to break the side window with a heavy multi-tool that somehow hadn't been jettisoned during the accident. She then crawled out, fell into the water, and waded until she reached the shore before passing out. When she woke hours later, it was still daylight, and only then did she piece together what had happened. But despite still being alive, the view from her vantage point wasn't particularly encouraging. She saw nothing but ocean, rocks, and the unscalable cliffs, and though she could hear and even see vehicles on the road above, she knew the likelihood of the occupants seeing her or hearing her screams were slim at best. Hungry, sunburned, dangerously dehydrated, suffering from internal and external wounds, and clad only in tattered clothes and torn socks, she began the hopeless task of searching for help after lapping water from mossy rocks on the cliffs. Above, unbeknownst to her, Hernandez had been reported missing by her family when she'd failed to turn up at the appointed time. The Monterey County Sheriff's Office disclosed that she had been last seen by a highway surveillance camera on Highway 1 near Big Sur, but heavy fog had moved into the area, adding another challenge for first responders, and even foul play wasn't ruled out. Meanwhile, Hernandez passed the days in pain, hiding from the blinding sun, at night dreaming about being rescued, even seeing the faces of her would-be saviors. Then, with her situation worsening by the minute, she was found by an outdoorsy couple who often hiked and explored along the coast. Chad and Chelsea Moore were shocked at the shape of the Jeep, but they didn't see any blood, though they were sure they'd find a body since they assumed there couldn't possibly be any survivors. The couple walked up the beach collecting items that had spilled from Hernandez's car and eventually found her lying amongst the rocks. When she saw the couple, she first thought it was just another dream. Chelsea went for help while Chad stayed with Angela until rescue teams arrived, roped down a stretcher and lifted her to safety before whisking her away to a nearby hospital. All told, the ordeal had lasted for 7 days, and Hernandez had suffered from a fractured collarbone and ribs, a brain hemorrhage, and a collapsed lung, the latter two of which could have been fatal. Not surprisingly, Hernandez and her rescuers have become friends, and despite her injuries, she's made nearly a complete recovery. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe, and as always, thank you for watching.